have been informed.
Good. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you this morning, despite our technology struggles.
Yeah. You doing good?
I'm doing very well. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Let's talk about Chuck Owen, the composer, and get off this horrible subject of COVID. Let me start by, and I'll pretty much follow the script unless we get in an interesting sidebar off script, which is great. But I figured by generating some questions to start the ball rolling, it would lead to good conversation for sure.
Sure.
If I'm not mistaken, of that entire multi-movement suite, the concerto, that the only movement that actually was written earlier as a small group piece was the one that we've been examining.
Right.
Is that true?
Yeah, it was true. And as I think you pointed out on your notes, that it was written for Jack Wilkins' first album as a leader, called Ridgelines. And the original instrumentation was like 5 horns, so it wasn't a real small group.
That's good. Yeah,
it had enough horns to do that little clustery sort of voicing. So that just transposed almost as was into the other one. I actually played synth on it too, so there were actually hints of string lines that I used later on, but most of the string stuff was not done. But I did use the strings or the synth sounds to kind of fatten the horn lines, which is, of course, the way I used the strings later on. I really...
So it wasn't a quantum leap to...
It wasn't. It was, I felt like it made a lot of sense. And in fact, when I first started conceiving of doing this piece, I thought of it kind of right away and rejected using it instantly, because I did not want to use anything that had been written before. I wanted this whole thing to kind of feed off of it. In fact, all the other movements basically feed off the first movement. All the material comes from that one. So it felt weird to me to insert this piece, which would not have any of those motivic gestures or, into it. And yet, at the same time, conceptually, in terms of the concept of river runs, this fits so beautifully into that concept. I mean, it was written about thinking of myself on top of this bluff overlooking, the river, the Green River, and also it just felt like it was written for Jack initially. That worked. It just felt like it made sense in terms of the whole piece. So it was the very last decision I made. I had written the other 4 movements, and I finally just decided, I just don't think that I'm going to do better than I wanted, a kind of this ballad in this portion. And so I kind of somewhat reluctantly at first, but as soon as I got kind of going with it, I thought, this is, it's going to work great. So.
I think it fits beautifully. And the contrast between each one of the movements is wonderful. Each movement is coming from a different place. And as far as reusing material, we all do it if it works, if it makes sense.
Yeah. It was really more that I love this idea of trying to build this whole big piece out of very small, central ideas and central motivic elements. And actually ended up doing much more of that than I thought I was going to do. I had this concept at first, but as we know, when you're writing music, the idea of concepts is great to organize thoughts and to inspire thoughts. It's a real fallacy to have that be a rigid archetype that you have to, that's just going to constrain everything. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It got me thinking in different ways, and inspired certain things. And then at some point in time, I said, okay, but it doesn't work here.
Right. Yeah, you can really box yourself in.
Yeah.
If you rigidly try to apply those guidelines and not dare step outside that boundary, because that gets in the way of what we really want, which is some sort of creative flow that comes out of a small kernel of an idea.
Right. I mean, I know with students, I kind of have pushed the idea of conceptual thinking a lot, but I've run into similar problems with a number of them. Is they take it too literally, and so they want, they want almost every gesture to mean something, and at some point in time, it's as much as I believe in music as storytelling, it's music.
Yeah, of course.
It's not a actual narrative, step by step by step, and so, yeah. So anyway, I'm glad I backed off on this.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did too. I'm not sure whether I can't remember whether I said this in your chapter. It certainly would have been appropriate, or perhaps another chapter, but it made me think about something that Manny Album had said.
Oh yeah, you did mention. Yeah, you mentioned that in there.
Because I've
never heard him say that, but that's great.
It was so apropos.
Yeah,
and that was one of his things, because I remember years and years and years ago studying with him in the Summer Arrangers Institute, and he said something very similarly to that. And it wasn't, again, about boxing yourself in, but it was about giving you direction. An initial direction to get you to the music writing. But he was a firm believer that you couldn't get to the music writing before you had that seed of a story,
Yeah, I kind of believe in that too. I mean, I don't think you have to have that, but I think some people but for me, I find my writing is much more inventive. It's more meaningful to me. And which means I think freer if there's something underlying it, whether it's an emotion, or a story line, or
an event in your life that was really meaningful. Yeah. Well, as you know, I really struggled to decide which movement to use.
Yeah, I know you did.
Because they were all good and they all had something different to talk about. In the end, I had to think about the other scores and the other chapters, and also just trying to get at as many things as I could get at that would be instructionally useful.
Absolutely, yeah.
And because not to make you feel any different, or so you don't feel any different, I did the same thing with Tim Garland. Tim Garland and I went back and forth, is struggling with which score of his to use, because there were so many wonderful things to talk about in each one of them. We finally came to grips with that and we agreed on one. So let's talk about that one, the one we did choose in the end. You're very, very meticulously careful about balancing your orchestrations using appropriate dynamic markings, more so than other people, I would say.
Really?
And it's very clear to me that you're taking into consideration your knowledge of the idiosyncrasies of these instruments, what they're strong at doing, what they're not strong at doing. And can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe even at what stage you put dynamic markings in a score like that?
That's actually, to me, almost a more interesting thing. But to start off with, I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about dynamic markings, as well as articulations and bowings and other instructions. Anything that's going to give the musician the best chance of realizing this the way I want, without, in my mind, hopefully I'm there, but without me being there.
Right.
So it's always been important. That was taught to me early on, and so it's always been something I've done. As you probably noticed, I love, and this is true in all my big band writing too, I love kind of cross-sectional writing and kind of small groups of disparate instruments.
Yes.
But in doing that, you inevitably run into balance issues, and if you hear a group, I'm just going to take something kind of arbitrary out of an alto flute and a trombone and a guitar or something like that. There's instruments there that have more attack or volume on attack. There's instruments that sustain better, and the tail. So I'm always trying to think of, okay, because it's not necessarily that I want that 3-person group to be absolutely balanced. If I could sit there and with a slider and get them exactly the same dynamic level, that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. I may be looking for that guitar to provide the attack to that note, and the alto flute to provide the tail, that what I end up with, and the trombone to provide the bulk or whatever. But I do, in thinking of all those and trying to hear it, I try and figure out what the appropriate dynamic marking is that's going to be meaningful to the person who's playing that, and give them the best chance of achieving this sound that I'm hearing.
Right.
Ultimately, my hope is that they get past that dynamic marking and they start hearing the thing and they start balancing themselves. Because, mezzo forte is such, like anything, it's such a broad, and I don't want to get too precious with this and say it's a mezzo forte or a forte mezzo forte or whatever, So, so mezzo forte may not really do it, they may have to work with that, but at least it gives them a fighting chance to get somewhere in the ballpark initially. And that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Well, I remember having that kind of conversation with some of my students years ago, or actually in rehearsal when we were working on someone's piece. And this issue that we're married to this very limited set of dynamic markings, which are extremely limiting. And you take into consideration the fact that no two people are going to share exactly the same notion of what forte is.
Right.
And so that's an issue. And I think what you said makes the most sense, which is that it gets them to a place where they can make those judgments themselves.
Right.
And the dynamic markings that you indicate only sort of help get them there. But in the end, they're fine players, we hope. And they're going to reach that balance.
Yeah, and they know a little bit more confidently how to play that note too on the first couple of playings too. It's if you don't have anything there, they're just guessing.
Right, exactly. Now, going back to the second part of the question that I sort of added this morning, when do you decide to actually put in the dynamic markings?
I loved it. I advocate for the idea of putting them in as soon as I write them. Same thing with articulations.
Oh, interesting.
And part of that is my own inability to remember. I have fortunately really good powers of concentration in the moment, and then I get past the moment and it's a blank. It's done. I move forward.
I get you.
So part of that is just to make sure I remember how I wanted that phrase articulated and exactly what I perceive. But and I try and do that in sketches when I'm working with pencil sketches and all that sort of thing. But I really do the very complete thing when I'm in more orchestration mode, and that's at the computer. And so then I'm trying to be much more specific and putting in all the parts. So in the sketch, I might have that I'll go back to that trombone, alto, flute, guitar thing. I might have written a single line for them and just put trombone, alto, flute, guitar there and put mezzo piano. So I know the line is supposed to be mezzo piano, but when I go to score, now I'm, extrapolating those into 3 separate lines. Now I'm going to look at that alto flute line and say, this needs to be mezzo forte because it's just not going to blend with the trombone well enough at a mezzo piano.
Mm-hmm.
And the guitar, I might make the piano because all I really want to hear is a little bit of attack at the beginning of the thing.
Right. And the guitar has that wonderful ability to combine with other instruments that
Right.
yield something so different as an end result that's amazing. Well, you opened the door to something that I'm not sure I even wrote down, and
Oh, that's okay.
I'm not sure why I didn't, because I always ask the question about creative process. Um, you know, how much do you do sketches? How involved are the sketches before you actually move to the computer and the orchestration end of things? Do you have the whole piece sketched out, and do you do sketches in pencil and paper the old way?
Yes, I do. I'm
Good for you.
I'm definitely as far as the sketch goes, I'm a pencil, or actually these days pen, because what I tend to do is I'll do a very basic. I do an outline first. Usually, I try and hear as much of the piece in my mind
Uh-huh.
as I can all the way through. So at least I know where I'm heading with this thing. That outline is inevitably flawed. It's going to change. That's okay. But it gives me a kind of a starting point. I want to be able to be in the moment too. And so if all of a sudden I go off outline, that's fine. But I do question myself then. Why am I going off?
Why? Yes.
And is it just because I'm, all of a sudden found something that else, it's like squirrel,
Yeah.
I want to avoid those moments. But if it's really furthering the narrative or whatever, then that's great. Then I've just discovered something that is really an important part. So I'm open to that. But yeah, I'm writing. Then I go from the outline into. I try and do as much sketching as I can. But where I've gotten to these days is in that kind of interest of time is I'll often take one day's sketch and put it into Finale, into a full score format in Finale. So I may just have a line.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll put it in the tenor sax part because I know a tenor sax is going to play it, but I have no earthly idea who else is going to play it at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I may have a counter line that goes along with that. I'll sketch that. I'll go ahead and put that in. Then the next day I will take that score paper. So it's kind of acting still as a sketch, and I'll have it out there. I may be writing on and not orchestrating that at all, but I may have other ideas than how to, hey, I'm going to want some sort of pad behind this. So at least I can start saying trombone pad, and I'll just write that in, or I'll pencil it in or whatever. I'll put in as much. I try and avoid huge amounts of detail. I don't try and do big voicings or anything like that when I'm sketching, because it just slows the whole creative process down. And
yes,
I know I can do that. I mean, that's stuff that I can do, falling asleep practically. But
yes,
it's coming up with the flow and the melodic lines. That to me is the part that's so crucial, and that I need to be able to hear, and it needs to work. And so that's what I spend most of the time in sketching doing.
Yeah, and to me, that you follow what I call the brain game, in that you're getting well past that fear of the blank white page by, you said, maybe I know exactly what the tenor sax is going to play, so I'll put that in the score, but I really don't know what else is going to go in there. But by doing that, you're keeping the creative process moving forward at all times. You're not letting your brain fall into that rut. Oh my God, I can't come up with anything, but you did. So put it down. So put it down.
And the nice thing about a sketch is it also feels a lot. Changing it is not a big deal, right? I mean,
right, exactly.
You can change it and honestly, it's a lot different these days with Finale. It's pretty easy to change in Finale too. But in the old days when I was doing hand scores, if you put it in the score, oh my gosh, you did not want to go back and change anything, and you resisted change like mad.
Oh, I remember. How well I remember the days where we set a little cassette recorder on the piano while we noodled,
No, it's, but I still find actually students very resistant to change. Once they get it down on the page somehow, they don't want to, especially if it's in Finale and it looks pretty and all that sort of, they don't want to change it.
Yes. Yes.
And there's something about that pencil and paper that I find it just easier just to say, that's no good, and take that page and just toss it in the trash can and, start another one.
Yeah. Or take the eraser out
or take the eraser out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much, I think, the way I tend to work too. And I'm trying to remember how I even deal with dynamics. I think in the old days, I used to wait till the end, and then I would think about the piece and hear it through in my head or perhaps on the computer. And then I would start putting dynamics in. But now I tend to do it on the spot, much more, I think, the way you've come to do dynamics.
Well, and again, when I started that conversation, I said that's my preferred way of doing it. In terms of actually doing it, it's probably 50-50. There's a lot of times where I don't take the time. I'm just in the line and all that sort of thing, and all of a sudden I realize, hey, I didn't put articulations, and it's particularly galling to me when I go back to page 3 of 65, and I look at a phrase and I don't remember anymore how I heard this thing articulated, and it drives me nuts because I remember that, I really heard it, so and I don't remember it now.
Yes, and of course you hit on the real advantage of doing it in the moment.
In the moment, yeah.
Rather than putting it off till sometime later, when you just don't really remember how you heard it. And those dynamic markings and phrase markings are so important to the end result.
95% of them are going to be, even if you've forgotten what you were thinking, you're going to hear it the same way again. It's just the way the phrase kind of lays. But every now and then you write a phrase that doesn't. And those are the moments where you really wish you had put in that articulation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you take the risk. Let's talk about key signatures for a moment. You stuck with 3 flats through the entire piece, even though there were these momentary modulations or suggestions of key changes, but you stuck to flats. Is there a method behind that? Is there a rationale that you consciously did this or not?
I tend to be pretty chromatic in many things that I write. Most of what I guess write in terms a lot of things. So I run into this all the time. And I do occasionally modulate and change key signature in the piece when I think it's significant, and it's going to last for a time. In this particular time, really the only place that it truly, the piece modulates is, I think as you pointed out in your analysis, is towards the end where it kind of goes up an augmented fourth. And it only goes up for 8 bars.
That's right.
And then it's right back. And so it just didn't feel to me, there's always a little bit amount of reader, not confusion, but they have to pay attention to see them. I would just prefer to keep it there and avoid, a lot of times with pieces, I honestly consider just not using any key signature at all, because my music is so chromatic in many cases that it just feels like it makes it simpler. Other times I really struggle over what key. This one actually felt pretty, it starts, again, you pointed out most of this in your analysis. It starts in kind of an E flat over G sort of mentality, but it cadences in C minor. So it's in that range, in the pivotal spots. But the melody itself starts on that A flat minor, chord, and that feels kind of like 1 when you get there, right?
Yeah.
It's not prepared in any way,
right?
It just hits, but it feels kind of like 1, which I think is great. But to change it to A flat minor there and then change it back to C minor just a few bars later, that to me just is, you're kind of asking for trouble. As far as the flats and sharps things go, that's also a constant issue. But the one thing that I believe in is making the parts as readable and as logical as possible for the player. And it really doesn't matter whether that, as much of a theory nerd as I kind of was in college and all that sort of thing, I don't want this feeling that the score has to look enharmonically beautiful somehow. It's not about the score; it's about the parts and that the players are playing. And if it makes more sense for them to be reading a sharp than double flats, I'm going to write sharps. I don't care if the trombone is playing flats or not.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out in your analysis also that some instruments are, I mean, guitarists are much more comfortable reading sharps.
Yes, and strings
trombonists,
as well.
or trombonists want to see flats, and
That's
so
right.
I keep that in mind too.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's really important with strings, and guitar. That falls into that same category. It's all in the end about player courtesy. Let the theorists, and I sort of walk that tightrope in analyzing everyone's scores, because I'm trying to make it theoretically explain something and have it make sense. But at the same time, I would have written it probably the same way that you or any of the other composers did, because it's just more logical and it's more courteous to the musician who's got to play it.
Yeah, the one place when I saw your question and I looked at the score, the one place I thought, oh well, I might want to rethink this is there's like a Divisi cello part towards the end, and so the top cello is playing the sharp lines with the rest of the strings.
Right.
And in unison. But the bottom cello part is playing the bass line, which is playing flats. And so I left them that way to be consistent with the rest of the score. And they read individually, they read fine, but seeing that, they're going to be reading off of the Divisi part. Right. So seeing if you're seeing the top part but you're seeing those flats below you, that might be a little bit disconcerting. I don't know. So that was the one spot I thought, maybe I should have read that.
But it worked.
Nobody said it. Nobody gave you grief. So
that's a good segue too. You were very specific about how you divided strings in terms of Divisi and using specific bowing techniques for effect and so on. On the other hand, you did not specify bowings. And I don't say that this is a negative, because I don't think in any of the scores, in all 10 scores in this book, no composer specified bowings.
Now, when you say that, because this one took me aback, because I feel like I bow most everything. And I went back and I looked at the score and I thought, oh, the bowings. And then I thought, so are you talking about up bow, down bow?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So no, that's actually, I put in bowings, but I purposely do not put in up bow and down bow unless I want a special effect. I leave that to the concertmaster.
Yes. As did all the other composers.
Yes. And that was actually that was a lesson that I learned, courtesy of the Atlanta Symphony, but very, very remotely courtesy, is a conductor whose name will not be revealed went up there to conduct a piece with them and decided, because he was a very anal sort of person, to put in all of the bowings on every up bow, every down bow on every.
I hope he was a string player.
He was not.
Oh.
And they ate him alive.
Yeah.
That's so. Again, it's like articulations and dynamics. I feel like the string players need to see phrase marks, which I call bowings. So, and so if you'll see 3/4 notes and there's a phrase mark over it, I obviously want that taken in one bow. And I would expect that to happen. In this piece, you see a lot of that. But you also see notes that do not have any phrase marks over them. Those I would want a different bow on each note. So, and a piece that's as slow as this and it has as many quarter notes as this, you're going to find that more frequently they are, using separate bows on each note.
Right.
But still, you'll find a lot of things in there where I have phrase marks over 2 notes or 5 notes or whatever, indicating the bowings.
Right.
Even there, Now this piece really wasn't a problem. I don't recall any issues with bowings on
I
string.
wouldn't think so. No.
But with some of the other movements, there were. And a lot of times I use bowings in my pieces and the bowing will end at a spot where they're not used to ending, because it's an accented note, a syncopated note in the brass or something like that. And so I want a separate bow there, whether it's a down bow or an up bow, it doesn't matter, but I want the attack of the bow. And so that will happen maybe on the end of 3 or and of 1 or whatever. And they are not used to that. And so I did have some questions, and the concert master would come to me and say, hey, do you mind if we bow this like this? 9 times out of 10, when the concert master says, hey, do you mind if we bow it like this? I'm saying, absolutely, that would be fine. I get it, But those are the situations where I have to stand my ground and I have to say, no, and here's why. And if you'll listen to what the trumpet players are playing, they're hitting this note. And when I explained it, at least my string players were just absolutely wonderful about it. They kind of got it. And it was a little awkward for them at first, and they let me know that. But they got the musical idea, and it just had to get in a different frame of mind.
Well, you explained your rationale for wanting them to do what you wanted them.
It wasn't just do it my way. Here's,
Exactly. It wasn't an authoritarian trip on your part. And there are those occasions, like if you got a Hitchcock movie with the psycho scene, where you're going to want consecutive down
bows, absolutely,
and you're going to write that.
Absolutely, yeah. And every now and then there's an entrance I want to sneak in, and I'll put up bow for that, because I just want it to kind of just glide in, and then ultimately there's a big down beat coming later that I wanted to use a down bow.
Sure.
And I won't have to write that because I've written the up bow on the first note.
Exactly, which leads them to where you want them.
Right. Yeah.
Want them to be with a stronger down bay. Do you remember offhand what your distribution of strings, like how many of these and how many of those you had in the session?
I don't. That was something I actually meant to look up before I talked with you.
Well, maybe you can shoot me an email when you.
I can. Yeah. There's something you sent me that had a number. Do you remember where that was?
No.
And do you remember where you got that from? I was wondering. I was wondering if I had shot that to you before. But the reason I mentioned that is I saw that number, and I think it said something like.
If I used a number, it was something that I got from you.
Okay. Well, and it may be accurate, but I think it listed about 25 total strings. I thought I had a few more than that. And I think your thing, I'm doing off the top of my head now, listed like 6 violins, 6 first violins, 5 seconds, 6 violas, 4 celli, and 2 basses. Now, I think the last part of that's right. I think the 6 violas, 4 celli, and 2 basses are right.
Yeah, actually, this is what I had in the chapter. 6 violin 1, 5 violin 2, 6 viola, 4 celli, 3 contrabasses.
That is not a proportion I would typically use. So if it ended up that way, it's because some violins didn't show up.
Okay.
Because typically, if I've got 6, the last part, 6 violas, 4 celli, 2 basses is right. That's exactly. But I'm sure I started with more violins than that. Now, whether I ended up with them, that's the part I don't remember. I don't remember people not. I remember some subs at the last minute.
Yeah.
But that could have happened. That could have happened. I had my principal cellist kind of contract the strings. I told him what I wanted, and I'm thinking it was something more like 8 first, 7 seconds, 6 violas. That's what typically I would kind of gravitate. That sort of ratio, or if you will.
Yeah. Well, you have to think about all those divises. And are you going to have the
divises
mass?
Came into it, and just the general balance of the strings, and but yeah.
Okay, so I'm in the ballpark anyway.
Yeah. It's pretty close, and I can't dispute it. I may have sent you those numbers. I just don't remember. I don't even know where I have them.
You probably did, because I don't think I pulled them out of the thin air anywhere.
Yeah, I doubt it.
And it's not marked in the score. I don't think there would be no reason for it to be. market.
No, it's not. In point of fact, although we may get there later, but I mean, doing it a lot. We actually overdubbed the strings. So we,
I was going to ask you how you did that.
Yeah, we did an overdub. My engineer has done a lot of string recording before, and he said that the first overdub will add a little bit of heft to it. He says probably not as much as you want or as much as you think, but it will add a little bit. And he said beyond that, it doesn't. It's like a bell curve. It falls off really quickly in terms of any. He said the amount of money you would spend to record a third time versus any sort of significant. You're just not going to get it. So we did one overdub with that number of strings. So essentially, whatever I said I had kind of double, not quite. In terms of sound, it's still about only 2/3. Even if those were absolutely just felt like they were there, still only 2/3 of what I expect to have in a regular symphony orchestra.
Right.
What I'd love to have.
Of course. Wouldn't we all?
Yeah.
Did have you ever done it live?
Yeah. I know you did. That was another question. So we've done it twice live, the whole thing twice live, and I've done the first movement also by itself. We did it at Manhattan School of Music. They did it, which was a lot of fun because every time we've done it, we've had pro soloists, but really talented student orchestras. I mean, both. So we did it at Manhattan. We did it at Cincinnati Conservatory, and both have great orchestral programs in addition. to really strong jazz programs. Yeah. But so like in Manhattan, we had Donnie McCaslin playing tenor, and and the other Jack Wilkins on guitar. And Sarah Caswell. It's the first time I actually had worked. I had known Sarah before, but it was the first time I had worked with her playing my music, and so she was playing violin on that. And,
wonderful player. Yeah.
So I mean, she didn't play on the. Obviously, she didn't play on the recording. She did it live.
Yeah, but you had somebody who is a violinist that was
Rob Thomas.
Sensible to jazz. Yeah, I mean.
Oh no, he's incredible.
That was very clear.
He was first.
Before I looked at the personnel list and so on, I assumed it was her, because of the jazz sensibility, But he's a beautiful player.
He is. He's a wonderful player. He was with the New York String Trio for a long time. Then he was with Mahavishnu, the new Mahavishnu Orchestra or something like that.
Yeah.
I think he's relocated back out to. He was originally from Oregon, although all the time I used him on 3 albums. I think all the time I used him, he was living in New York at the time. But I think he's moved back to Oregon. Well, but anyway, all of those concert performances were terrific in terms of there were great people to work with. There was never enough rehearsal time. Of course, it was and I wasn't rehearsing. I didn't conduct any of it. Justin DeChocho conducted the one at Manhattan, and then the orchestra conductor at Cincinnati. I can't remember his name. Scott Belk was the one that had me in, but it was the orchestra conductor who conducted the thing, and he did a wonderful job.
Nice.
He just basically had memorized almost the entire score. It was really impressive.
Yeah, really. And subsequently, you did a big band chart on the same piece, right? That you did with WDR.
Yeah, we it's still not released yet. I changed it though, so I made the solo parts are trumpet and piano now.
Oh, okay. Well, Billy Test is wonderful.
yeah, exactly. And Rude Brules plays the solo, and and he just sounds great too. So.
Yeah. Well, everybody's records are held up. I mean, COVID has become the universal excuse for everything, but it's been true. It's had a lot to do with a backlog of projects.
Right. That's been the problem there. And it was supposed to have been mixed back in September or whatever, and now it's scheduled for first part of April, I think, to be mixed.
Oh yeah.
We're
Yeah.
still hoping to get it out this year, but it's going to be more of a challenge than I thought.
Well, let's go back to your score for a minute, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the voicings,
Okay.
particularly these modal like scale clusters. Did you have any tuning issues with those?
No, not that I recall.
I think particularly I asked the question because the string section was not big. So you start chopping them up in a Divisi and giving them those clusters. That would make me nervous if I did that, because I would be a little bit worried that they might struggle with intonation issues.
Yeah. I mean, again, I had
you had great players.
Great players. They're the top, symphony players around here, not jazz people.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter.
Right. So I trusted a lot in that. But the other thing is, in this piece, and this movement is very different from most of the other movements in this regard. The strings are doubling winds most of the time.
That's true.
I don't really do that very much, but in this piece, it made sense because so much of this stuff was already conceived from doing the earlier version.
Right.
And there I used like a synth pad occasionally to double, almost an organ-like pad to double the voicing. So here it just became kind of the strings, but I didn't want it to be a thick, big sounding string texture. I want it to be small, which is why you see the Divisis and a lot of times restricted numbers of players on.
Yeah, right.
Half of the section playing Divisi.
Right.
And so I just wanted this shimmer that was added to the brass voicing. But the string players then had the advantage, and this was true not only with intonation, I think, but this was very, very much true with phrasing. They had the advantage of hearing the brass and playing with that. So they could hear, our brass players are a lot more used to some of these clustery sort of voicings.
Right.
Guys in my jazz surge band are very used to it.
Yeah.
So they know to hold their own ground, and when they're sitting right next to him on a minor second or whatever. So and there's also an openness to those voicings. There's a very typically a perfect fourth in between the two little clusters.
Yes. Yeah.
So it gives people kind of an anchor to to hear.
Yes, you left a space. You left a space either at the top or in the middle, or.
Yeah, it's very common for me, and in this case with that opening salvo, that's a lot of minor seconds at the tops because it's not particularly melodic. It's very it's just about the cluster, the sound. But a lot of times when I use clusters, and there's a melody or a strong melody that I'm trying to bring, I do exactly what you just said. So I try and leave a space at the top to isolate that melody to allow it room to breathe.
Right.
And then I put the density below it someplace.
Right. Right. And I think that's a general rule that most of us follow. If we do cluster stuff and we have a melody that we need to make prominent. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's see. What else did I want to cover here? We already talked about performing the piece live. What would you like people to know about this piece that I missed?
I thought you did a great job. I don't really know that as much.
I really wanted to write about the one that comes before this.
I know you did. That one came with a lot more problems too.
The next time we'll talk about that.
Yeah. It's funny going back to the live thing just for a second. This one takes almost no rehearsal to play. It's a really simple to play. It just kind of it's not all that challenging for other than the soloists for really any of the sections, especially not the strings. It's pretty straightforward. That's probably not true with any of the other movements, but especially the first three.
Yeah. That's another good question. If I can interrupt and ask it before I forget it.
Yeah.
I have a tendency to do. Speaking of pieces with complicated harmonic structures, complicated changes, with lots of chromatically altered tones or chords over foreign bass tones and this and that. You obviously, if you want your rhythm section to not collide with whatever you've written across the orchestra, you have to be very specific in giving them the most accurate symbol you can give them, or maybe not. Maybe you give them a simplified version of that symbol. And then in terms of the soloists who are improvising over those complicated symbols, how much do you give them? Do you give them everything? Or do you scale that back and give them the essential? What's your philosophy about that?
And again, that varies. It's kind of like some of the other things we've discussed. I want to make the parts meaningful but legible for the players, and that oftentimes means not giving them absolutely everything that's going on. Every now and then in a rehearsal, I'll have a soloist who says, "Hey, you know, I'm hearing such and such a tone being played back there, but I don't have it on my, you know." And I said, yeah. It's kind of a passing tone, but it's fairly prominent because it's the top of the voicing. And I said, you can incorporate it if you want, or totally ignore it if you want. But I chose not to give it because I thought it just would make it too complex. And
Right.
People, and so every now and then I get called on something like that. If it's a specific voicing that is really integral to me, and this happens probably more frequently for me in trombone section, I'll write a voicing that is exactly what I want to hear. And so rather than give the pianist changes at all, I'll just give the pianist the voicing. If it, you know, for a while.
So there's no question about.
And many times I don't even know what chord I would write, to be quite honest. You know, it's because it's not about the chord; it's about these voicings over a bass line.
Yes.
And you know, I've gotten so far. Again, I was such a good boy. I had a nice theoretical background, and I played by all the rules for a long time. And there wasn't a single day when I did this. It happened over a long period of time, but I gradually weaned myself away from some of those rules to the point where I write great swaths of music these days and don't have a clue what any of the chords are.
Of course. Well, and I think that's because you've gotten more and more driven by this kind of writing.
Yes, very much so.
Left to right writing, as opposed to a concern about this, the vertical sonorities. So there's no need to label them. But what there is a need to do, I found, at least in my own work, it is to be very specific in giving them the voicings that I want them to use.
Absolutely. You know, and when I talk with students about sketches, that's one of the things I say. I tell them, don't spend time voicing, like we talked about before, voicing out chords. It's a C7 flat 9. You know it's in a C7 flat 9. You don't need to spend time when you're sketching, writing out how you're going to voice that chord. However, if it's a structure, some sort of structure, you know, that the structure at the beginning of this movement that we're looking at is a perfect example. That's not a structure that, if I said E flat major sharp 11, which I did, that's not necessarily what you're going to play as a pianist or a guitarist or whatever. Right. That structure is crucial to the sound of this thing.
Well, and to use your previous examples, the C7 sharp 9, what if you really wanted a shell that was E flat, E natural, if we're doing it in C, E flat or D sharp, if we're being enharmonically correct, D sharp, E, B flat. And that's all you wanted.
That's all you wanted. Then you have to write that out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that might be an integral sound to what drives this piece.
And that's exactly what I always talk about, is the idea of an integral sound. If it is integral to the piece, then it needs to be written out in sketch when you're doing the sketch. If
Yeah,
not,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, because writing C7 sharp 9 just doesn't cut it.
Right, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, and I mentioned in one of your analysis too that you didn't find much functional harmony. Actually, there's probably more functional harmony in this movement than the others too.
That's true. I would agree.
But I've kind of, and I'm not trying to avoid functional harmony for the most part. I just don't really hear it. And so
I'm not there anymore myself.
Yeah, I'm always trying to, but there has to be a logic, and it's an interesting term, functional harmony, what that implies, because I do think your harmony or your harmonic progressions have to be functional from the standpoint that the listener has to buy them. They have to find a logic. They have to be able to follow it. Otherwise, you're going to lose them. But there's so many ways of doing that aren't embedded with 6251.
Well, no, exactly. That's just, and that was the point that I made, I think, in perhaps your chapter, and I know others as well, is that the functionality is derived more from voice leading and how you get from this sound to that sound. And the fact that you're sharing a common tone, you're moving a stepwise direction here or there. That's what makes it work for the listener.
Yeah, or even those structures, like that structure at the beginning. After I hit that first one, I could go almost anywhere as long as I'm using that same structure. It doesn't really matter where I go because that structure is the logic,
That's right.
Right? Sometimes you can have almost anything you want over a bass line. If the bass, that happens a little bit in this piece there's pretty much a 1-5, 2-5-1 in the bass, but the stuff on top of it is not following that, right?
No.
But that bass line just provides the logic. So as long as there's some sense of logic someplace that the listener, whether they really know it, they can follow it in some way without being, theoretical.
Correct. Just the other day, and this is just a sidebar, but since I can't interview Klaus Ogerman anyway, I'll tell you what I discovered. Because we're doing the last movement from In the Presence and Absence of Each Other with Michael Bracker. That's the score that's included. And interestingly, it really was only a 2-movement piece, despite the fact on the record, it's presented in 3 movements. So I won't divulge any more of that. But what I will tell you is that I just 2 or 3 days ago got a copy from the archive of Michael's solo part with his handwritten notes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Cool.
And he had to write symbols in. And, he even talked about this in an interview that he did when he did a clinic or a master class at UNT, North Texas. He talked about working with Klaus and saying how crazy his harmonic structures were and how he had to sit down and sort them out. And he was very meticulous in preparing, Michael was.
Yeah.
Preparing for every session, particularly, and that's very evident in looking at this part where he scribbles in this and that, and he even adds, I believe he adds some modal descriptions to what's going on, which would give him a better clue about how to approach that as a soloist. Interesting stuff.
Yeah. I know this piece that, not this one, but Rude Brules was playing on a piece we also recorded with WDR, and it's a standard, but it was one I had done just complete reharmonization. Really.
Yeah, big facelift.
Yeah. So he came up to me after we first read it, and he said, "Hey, Chuck, do you mind if we get somebody else to solo on this? This is, I can't really, And I was looking at him thinking, boy, this kind of makes sense. I don't know what else to tell him. But bless his heart, Billy Test took him aside. And I'm not sure what he said to him. He just showed him another way of looking at these same chord structures. And it just made all the difference in the world, you know. And it just opened the door. So people have, I mean, yeah, I think, that's where we get talking about chord symbols and what you give people and what you don't give. Obviously I didn't hit the mark as far as Rude goes. He's kind of more my age and everything, and maybe I'm not sure how old he is, but
Right,
but a
right.
little on the older. But for Billy,
Yeah,
this stuff all made perfect sense.
sure, sure. Well, I know I've on occasion when I know I've got harmonic structures that aren't going to be represented well if I try to put a symbol. I mean, I could do that, but
Mhm.
in the flow of things, the soloist probably just isn't going to get inside the harmony
Right.
like I'd like them to. That instead of that, I might do both. I put a chord symbol, but then I write a mode.
Oh, above it, yeah.
Yeah. And that really tends to help open a door. And maybe that's what Billy did, you know?
There wasn't one mode he could have done. This was more like changes sort of stuff,
Okay.
But there was something. Yeah, he had to have done something along those lines. Said, "Hey, look, if you think of this way, then you can almost,
Yeah.
harmonic minor for like 2 bars or whatever."
Right. Right.
Whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Um, what other experiences have you had in writing for strings in a jazz context that you can remember where you really learned something in particular that a light bulb went off? I know you've done things with other orchestras.
Yeah.
Can you
I,
think back? I'll do what Jim McNeely, or use the phrase Jim McNeely said in an interview I did with him. Put yourself in the Wayback Machine and see if you can remember something.
I was thrown to the wolves. My first, I think it was my first professional writing thing. First truly professional. I had done some other stuff, I guess, for small recording sessions, just 2-3 horn stuff, and then I think I had even done something for Lynn Viviana's big band, but I'm not sure I ever got paid for that. I think that was something I just sent him. But basically, I was just coming out of North Texas when I got a call from my dean to meet with the conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Pops down in Dallas. And I met with him for an hour and a half in the trailer right before they did a concert. And he hired me on the spot to do 2 pieces for the Cincinnati Symphony. Now, that's a pretty major symphony. And
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
this. And I've never written for strings in my life at this point in time.
Yeah.
So all I did was, what I had done is I'd done a lot of score stuff. I was even in a conducting class at the time with the orchestra teacher at North Texas, Anshel Brusiloff, and all we were doing was score study. And
Yeah.
so, I'd done a lot of string score study, and I'd done a lot of writing for big bands. So I just kind of put 2 and 2 together. My very first piece that I wrote for them was played on a concert with Ella Fitzgerald.
Wow.
So, it was, which I
Yeah.
sadly didn't get to hear live, but,
Yeah.
but from that point in time on, I did several other pieces for him that got played at San Diego and San Francisco and St. Louis symphonies, and because he was as a pops conductor, he was doing all of these.
Oh, of course, like
These,
others are doing in the pops world.
Yeah. So but so I did that. Then because I was doing that, I started writing for Roger Williams, the pianist, the small C pianist. I started doing big orchestra stuff for him. So I was doing a lot of string writing without honestly, really even hearing it when I think about it.
Yeah, you do it and ship it off, and that was it.
And that was it. And I remember that's what happened when I got hired to do the Metropole Orchestra stuff. They kind of contacted me out of the blue. I still, to this day, I don't know where they got my name, and asked if I'd be willing to write. Oh, well, I think it was because the tenor player whose album it was had asked for me. But and I shipped off this stuff overseas, and 9 months later, they sent me back a CD, and it sounded glorious.
Yeah.
And I will say that was the moment. I'd done all this writing for strings beforehand, but that was the moment I was hooked.
Yeah.
Totally hooked,
Yeah.
And so I did 3 more projects with them. And then at that point in time, doing this project became, and I had to wait a long time to do it, but this project became something that I knew I wanted to do.
Well, I mean, the ability for a writer to use strings adds such a whole nother dimension to what we can do. That takes us outside that big band thing.
Yeah, I'd never had the desire to do the kind of the big band and strings sort of stuff where they're pads.
Yeah. No.
It's just it wasn't that was never. But to do an album kind of like this was something that ever since I got that first Metropole thing back, it was just something I was going to find a way of doing it.
Well, and fortunately for all of us, you did.
Well,
it came out great.
Thanks to the Guggenheim Foundation.
Absolutely.
I don't know when I would have ever been able to even think about affording it. I still can't afford it to this day, but
well, no, I know those projects can really put a big hole in your pocket.
This one was an expensive one.
Yeah, I can believe that. Yeah. Well, after I stop the recording, if you can think, remind me to tell you my Lynn Biviano story.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You mentioned a name that I hadn't heard in
I know.
many years. Yeah. For the last question, I always ask everyone if they have any particular words of wisdom, suggestions about writing for strings that you'd like to pass on.
So I've got a few things I thought about that I've typically started with my students, with in the past, and I think are really critical that differentiate writing for strings maybe from writing from brass or a big band or whatever. One of the things is just the notion which we've already discussed is the importance of numbers. Strings are unlike, the winds in that you just can't have a first, a second, a viola, and a cello, and have that sound like an orchestra. It depends on numbers, and it depends dramatically on numbers. I've had so many students that have written for string quartet with big band, and even though I tell them it's not going to sound like a big lush orchestra behind, it's going to sound like a string quartet, which has a great sound, much more intimate, and everything. You can do a lot with it. But you just have to be aware of numbers, and that's going to impact what you write. It should impact what you write very, very dramatically. And it's something that's just so foreign to writing for a big band. What else? Oh, by the way, with the numbers thing, that Don Sebesky book, the Contemporary Arranger, that from ages ago. Actually, that was the first book I actually studied kind of string stuff, and other than just a traditional orchestration book.
It's good for that.
It is really good for the numbers, and not that I've tried those specific numbers that he used in the studio, but it just introduces the concept and how he manipulated all of that based on his budget, and the effects he was trying to achieve. And so I don't know of another book that in the kind of the jazz realm that really delves into that.
No, you're right. I think that is the only book that really deals with those kinds of mechanics.
Yeah. And the other thing is probably an obvious thing, but you just this sheer range of not only a single string instrument, but then the whole string section as a whole offers. It presents a different challenge and offers many opportunities in terms of voicings that probably than we're used to in compact, instruments, the same instrument sections. Like a trumpet section, you've got a very narrow range, and you can fit them very compactly into that. But with strings spread out over the voicing itself has to be spread. If you're putting a single note on each section, it has to be a pretty spread voicing in most cases for it to sound good. And so that just takes a little bit of getting used to, and figuring that out. And score study for that sort of stuff. You can look for that sort of thing. You can look at Beethoven and Brahms and see instantly how things were spread there. And then after you kind of grasp that, you can get into Ravel and see when you can use some of these special effects and put clusters and
Right.
and all the
Right.
that sort of stuff.
Right.
So the score study, I relied on it because I didn't have like a string orchestra to write for before I was writing.
Right. Well, most of us didn't.
Right, exactly.
Most of us didn't. Or the experience was a very narrow window, you know, through an orchestration class or through. We were lucky, but Ray Wright didn't arrive until my senior year.
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
that was very limiting. Now, it was a great advantage in going back for my graduate work because he had really gotten the program more established at that point.
yeah.
And the studio orchestra became kind of almost one of the regular ensembles.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't meet regularly,
right.
but it met regularly enough
That you could write for it and expect to get it played.
That's right.
And that's what I tell. I mean, that's what I require all my graduate students to do. Is that when their graduate recital, they were required to write for strings as part of the. Now, getting the strings was totally on them.
Yeah.
So,
but that's part of the game.
It's part of the game. So, in most cases, they were writing for string quartets or something like that, or sextets. Unless they were fortunate enough to be able to persuade, and this rarely happened at our school, because we didn't have a studio orchestra. I just could never get anyone to buy into that. But I had a couple of folks that were able to persuade the orchestra conductor to play or read pieces and that sort of thing. So there's always different ways of getting, but that experience, I do think it's something that jazz composers, while they're in school, they need to take advantage of those resources. And
absolutely.
And right, I remember another great thing when I was working with Pat Williams out there, and I wasn't doing a whole lot of writing.
I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to go there.
Okay, well, Pat set me up with, and I cannot think of his, Jerry Vinci. Jerry Vinci was.
Oh, yeah.
You remember Jerry Vinci?
Oh, absolutely.
He was concert master for
everything.
Everything. Exactly. Well, so Pat set me up with him. He just said, go talk with Jerry Vinci and just ask him about what string players, and ask him anything you want, but talk to him.
Yeah.
So I did. I went over, and Jerry was as sweet as he could be, as gracious as he could be. And we spent an hour and a half or 2 hours just talking about the challenges that string players run into in studio sessions and
wow.
movies and things. And he took out his violin and played through some passages for me to just let me hear some things. And, it was,
what a great opportunity.
It was amazing. And so I told my students, I said, grab a violinist here. These are good violinists here. Grab a cellist, take him in a practice room, say, hey, play this. Well, can play it on the other string. Let me,
buy them a cup of coffee and drag them in a practice room.
Exactly. It was a wonderful thing.
Oh, absolutely. That was an invaluable experience. I had such trouble, again, since I can't interview Pat, unfortunately.
Right.
I had such an experience trying to get a hold of the score we ended up using.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, because the copy that I was able to get was a bad photocopy of his handwritten score.
Oh.
And it probably had been reduced some on a copy machine or something. And it was damn near illegible, to be honest. And finally, and I can publicly thank Vince Mendoza. Vince turned me on to an elderly gentleman, shall we say, I won't mention his name here on the interview, who worked with a lot of these guys as their sort of librarian, copyist, et cetera, et cetera. And this guy was a musician himself, I think maybe a trombone player. And Vince put me in touch with him. I contacted him. Not only did he get back to me, but he was willing to dig in his own archives and then take the trouble to scan what amounted to the original parts, which he had. or at least copies of the original parts.
part. Yeah.
So we literally reconstructed the score from scratch and built the score off the parts and compared it to the original photocopy that I got as much as we could, but it was a tedious process that
I'm sure.
Yeah,
To say the least.
And expensive too, I might add. Well, listen, thank you so much for not just lending us the score to use and to talk about for people to learn from in the book, but also spending the time online here with us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Rick. I mean,
really appreciate
I'm delighted you're doing this project, and I know how much time and effort you put into this thing, and I think it's wonderful. So
it's another labor of love. The first book was the same, and it's a way to keep fresh and keep moving forward, even during these COVID times.